Hot-Headed, Chapter 2, by Mufi Kitten. The first day of the new school year began at last. Ochako's alarm went off promptly at 7 a.m., giving her time to quickly shower and dress in her uniform, then run down to the dorm kitchen area where Aizawa-sensei had kindly arranged for a hearty breakfast to be set out for his students. Active heroes, even heroes in training, had to take in an incredible amount of calories to keep their energy up and their muscle mass thick, so there was the usual staples of rice, fish, miso soup and toast, as well as more caloric items such as bacon, eggs and sausage. Ochako's mouth watered at the absolute feast in front of her. A few other students from 3A were also digging in. Mina, Suyu and Toru sat together chatting excitedly, presumably about what might be going on in school that day. Deko and Ido were also conversing over their plates and looked up as she entered the room. "Uraraka-chan, come eat. Look at all this food," Deko explained with a wide, wholesome smile. Ochako felt her cheeks heat a little at his attention and returned with a warm smile of her own. "It looks so good. I love eggs." "I love eggs. Wow," she thought to herself. She approached the table and sat with her dearest friend since first year. Piling food on her plate, she stirred up a little conversation. "Phew, moving everything into a new dorm yesterday was fun, wasn't it?" Her sarcasm extremely obvious. In reality, moving hundreds, maybe even thousands of students into new rooms all in one day had to be a logistical nightmare for the school. It hadn't necessarily been crowded yesterday, but everyone was so busy going from place to place. Her classmates were constantly in each other's way. Once again, as with the past 2 years since they'd started housing students on UA property, each class had its own dormitory. The first floor held their living space, including bathrooms, laundry, and a kitchenette. Then each floor after the first held 8 rooms in all. One side of the building having 4 rooms for boys, the other side 4 rooms for girls. And it continued like that upward. Ochako wasn't sure if it might have just been easier to keep their old rooms each year and just change the names on the outside of the building. But the staff at UA had decided on how dorms would work, and if this was the best policy, she would go with it. They had been greeted by Aizawa-sensei, still their homeroom teacher, in the common living area that day, and had been given their room assignments. They seemed to enjoy mixing the students up every year, so it wasn't common for the same people to share the same floor from one year to the next. Since there were so few girls in their classes, like always, they never had to have a next-door neighbour, thus never had to deal with thin wall issues. Not that UA would ever skimp on any kind of quality, but sometimes people, especially Type A personalities like most people in Class 3A, were just generally loud and energetic people. Ochako felt fortunate that she got to share a floor, the second floor to be exact, with Mina, probably her closest female friend in class. Although, to be fair, Mina was close with everyone. She'd gotten the room closest to the elevator once again. The occupant of this room always had to deal with a little bit of sound when the elevator was in use, but this time, having been placed next door to the elevator for the past 2 years, it was more of a soothing background noise for her, and she would have been more irritated to have been placed away from it. "Yeah," Deko answered, a half-hearted smile on his lips. He seemed troubled. Ochako noticed and thought back on their confrontation with Kacchako, wondering if he was still feeling bad about it. "I didn't find it to be fun at all," Ida said, somehow now catching her sarcasm. "It was absolute mayhem. Everyone had boxes in the halls. I'm on the second floor with Mineta. Do you know how many anime girl figures he has?" "Yes," Deku cut in, a more genuine smirk. "His room was next to mine first year." Ochako giggled. "Well, it's probably doubled since then," Ida said. "I would not want to shine a black light in his old room. I hope they clean them well when we move out." Everyone in their group shivered. "Who else is on your floor?" Kacchako asked, trying to get an idea of where everyone else was placed as well as awful images out of her head. "Aoyama-kun and Kaminari-kun," he responded. Kacchako held back from making a face. Well, that'll be a lively floor, she thought. What about your cocoon? He asked courteously. Oh, well, you guys know that we get to be more separated than you, so I'm just sharing the floor with Mina. Ida nodded in approval. What about you, Deku? She turned to Deku. Well, he seemed troubled again. I'm on the 5th floor with Tokiyami-kun, Koda-kun. He hesitated a moment, a frown marring his features. Oh boy, Kacchako thought. And Kachan. She couldn't hold back from wrinkling her nose a little this time. His gaze slid to her, and she could tell that he was trying to assess just how much their confrontation had bothered her. Huh, she said, smoothing her features back in a calmer expression. I'm sure that will be fun. Deku kept his assessing gaze on her a moment longer before turning back to his food. Ida looked between them once or twice. Why do you keep saying things are awful are fun? Kacchako walked with her 2 friends the 5 minutes to school building, where they quickly found classroom 3A and took their seats. They arrived mere moments after Momo, who had claimed a seat in this front row. No surprise there. There was no seating assignments. This year was seemingly a year of freedom, but she knew it was likely more of a test to see if they had enough discipline to keep their studies up while forging much-needed bonds between other future heroes. Kacchako grabbed a seat in the 3rd row behind Deku and diagonal to Ida, who sat next to him. She and Deku sat next to the windows looking out over the vast and beautiful campus. She was a little excited that they overlooked some of the hero training grounds and that they'd get to see their Kohai training. A few more students trickled in, taking their seats around the room in relation to where they felt most comfortable. Kirishima and Mina sat all the way in the back, followed closely by Kaminari, who chose the seat in front of Kirishima. It was about 8:15 when the classroom door slammed open to reveal none other than Bakugo Katsuki. Kacchako sat up a little straighter, his words, "Get ready to be in for a world of regret," echoing back to her head. He entered and surveyed the room for a moment, his eyes alighting on the 2 boys who usually hung around, waving him over. Bakugo, here, Kirishima motioned toward the seat on the other side of him. Bakugo ignored them. Then his eyes found Kacchako. She bristled, and her face heated at his piercing stare. He quirked an eyebrow. Bakugo, Kirishima called again. Shut up, shitty hair, Bakugo snapped as he began to walk down the middle aisle. But he stopped short of reaching his friends in the seat they had saved for him, instead taking the one directly next to Kacchako. What the... she heard Kirishima whisper to Mina. We're allowed to sit where we want this year, right? He asked loudly to no one in particular. Everyone was staring anyway. A few people nodded. So, I'm going to sit here. Who has a problem with that? No one answered. Deku turned back in his seat to face Kacchako. Uraka-chan, are you okay with this? He asked, worry lining his face. He gave Bakugo a wary once-over. Bakugo glared back at him. Ida turned back to 2, also looking a little concerned and confused. She doesn't need you to save her, Deku. I haven't done anything yet. Mind your own business, Bakugo spat. Yet? Deku spoke quietly. Bakugo just smirked. Kacchako was feeling warm all over again. This guy, she thought. He wasn't joking yesterday. He's going to try to make me sorry. I'm not backing down from it now. I'm fine, Deku, she said, straightening in her seat. He's not bothering me. He'll never bother me. Bakugo got a wolfish grin on his face. See, Deku? Deku's eyes went to her, clearly not convinced, but not wanting to undermine her determination. Okay, well, if you're okay with it, he said with apprehension and turned forward again. Ida shot Kacchako and Bakugo a look each, but also turned back. The rest of the class had found their seats, as this exchange occurred, and only seconds after Deku had faced forward again, Aizawa-sensei inched his way into the room, cocooned in his usual sleeping bag. He slumped over his desk. "It is too early. I am not ready for loud sounds. Quietly determine your class reps for this year. When you're done, I'll talk about what is expected of you this year." With that, he took a nap behind his desk. Everyone looked around for a moment, probably less confused and more trying to figure out who they would quietly determine class representatives. First year, Ida had kinda appointed himself and Momo had been chosen. Last year had been Todoroki, a reasonably dependable guy in Ochako's opinion, and Mina, outgoing with strong leadership skills. This year seemed uncertain. Deku stood a little nervously and went to the chalkboard at the front, stepping over Aizawa-sensei. He took a piece of chalk and wrote, "Write the name of who you'd like to nominate on the board." He looked back at the class and everyone nodded in agreement. This is how they would decide. He wrote boy on one side of the board and girl on the other. Then he wrote his choices in first. Aoyama. Not a wholly unreasonable nomination. He was confident and outgoing. Aoyama seemed to sparkle a little brighter at being considered. Uraraka. Ochako froze. What? She wanted to scream, but refrained, knowing the consequences for doing so would be dire. Her face turned red as he turned back to her and smiled kindly. Bakugo scoffed and rolled his eyes. Ochako shot him a glare, but he was eyeing Deku instead, his nose wrinkled like he smelled something bad. After Deku retook his seat, they each went up one by one to nominate who they wanted in the order of the rows they were sitting in. It seemed a lot of their class had actually agreed with Deku, as most of the nominations so far were for her. But interestingly enough, her classmates were impressed with Deku taking charge so quickly and were nominating him. She was sure he was feeling nervous about it, considering he was far too humble to think he should be in charge of representing the class. It came around to her, and she quickly rose, scratched down Midoriya and Asui before scurrying back to the seat. There was no way she would ever vote for herself. Then it was Bakugo's turn. Ochako wasn't surprised when he simply passed on his turn, waving the next person to him. Shoji. She chanced to look at him from the corner of her eye. When she saw him openly glaring at her, she quickly looked away again. What is his problem? She thought to herself. It only takes one slight mistake to make yourself a target. After everyone had written their choices, the names were tallied, and as she had guessed, Ochako and Deku were voted in as class representatives. She felt honoured and slightly nervous as they made their way to the front of the classroom. Thank you for nominating Uraraka and myself, Deku said in a normal voice, probably comfortable with waking Aizawa-sensei up now. I hope we can represent you well and thank you for your support, Ochako said. Both of them bowed low. Bakugo tsked loudly and rolled his eyes again. Most of the class turned to him. Ochako barely concealed a snarl from her face. She felt her blood pressure begin to rise again. Is something wrong, Bakugo-kun? She asked a little curtly, trying to publicly shame him. She should have known that wouldn't work. Nothing wrong, Roundface, he responded with no shame at all. I think you two look adorable together. He rested his chin on one fist and a smirk came to his lips. The class was dead silent. Ochako's face went hot and she didn't even want to look over at Deku to gauge his reaction. She pressed her lips together in frustration, then before her common sense could stop her, she said, Thank you, Bakugo. I'll keep your opinion in my back pocket for whenever it matters. There were a few audible gasps as her classmates looked from her to Bakugo. His smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. You've got a lot of nerve, Floaty, he started, his voice starting to rise. Okay, we've got our class reps, Aizawa-sensei grumbled as he awoke from his little power nap. Everyone jumped. Yes, Sensei. The class chose me, and Midoriya-kun, Ochako supplied. Congrats, he said with no conviction whatsoever. Now on to the plan for this year. If you could all manage to keep on track, he eyed Deku and Ochako reclaimed their seats. Deku gave him a sheepish grin before turning to her to give her a look of solidarity and back to pay attention to Aizawa-sensei's announcements. It's your third year, so it'll be more difficult than ever, and more will be expected of you, he went on. By now you should have a good idea of how your quirk works and how you will utilize it as a hero. You should have a solid catalogue of moves and abilities you can use, and you should have a good idea of what you would like to be doing after you graduate. Kacchako continued listening for a few minutes and decided to steal a glance at Bakugo to see if he was still leering at her or planning some kind of retaliation. Her brows furrowed when she found him resting his head in his hand and nodding off. Nothing fazed him, even getting in a near spat with her yet again only minutes ago. She had just been elected class rep, and he was already being disrespectful. Was he doing this on purpose? Why was he getting on her nerves so badly all of a sudden? She thought back to that awful look Deku had on his face yesterday. Oh yeah, that was why. What had he said to make him look like that? She still didn't know, but she wasn't sure it would be polite to ask either. It could have been something embarrassing to talk about. She figured Deku would tell her if he wanted her to know. A jolt of electricity going through her again at being reminded of yesterday. She reached her foot out and none too gently jabbed at his leg with it. He didn't jump or even move his leg away from her like she'd expected. Rather, she hoped. She pettily realised because she wanted him to get in trouble. He only opened his eyes, slid them to her, a bored expression still dominating his features. His ruby eyes looked molten as they stared at her. Kacchako glared at him and jerked her head slightly to the front of the room as if to say, "Listen to the teacher, asshole." Well, she was thinking that at least. His eyes just focused on her, pinning her where she sat. His look was so intent, so unperturbed, just staring at her, trying to make her squirm. Those crimson irises seemed like they glowed with intensity. She could feel sweat starting to form at the back of her neck from the pressure of his gaze. Her hands balled into fists as she forced herself to stare right back at him. He shifted his legs suddenly, and she jumped at sudden movement. She flushed at having just been caught unaware, and he half smirked at her smugly before turning away from her to go back to dozing. Otraka ground her teeth and turned back to Aizawa-sensei. No one had noticed their exchange.